Hello, my name is Eric Bailey. I'm an extension beef nutrition specialist with the University of Missouri, and thank you all for attending our virtual field day. Today, what I'm going to be talking about is some stocker cattle research that I have been conducting over the past few years. I'd like to share the results from a couple of projects with y'all and really try to interpret those into what I see as the potential to develop some stocker cattle systems here in this state. Okay, so what we originally set off to do when we started down this line of research was investigate methods for controlling seed heads in Kentucky 31 fescue pastures. We know that the stems and seed heads that are developed in the late spring have significant concentrations of ergot-like alkaloids, and when cattle are exposed to these ergot-like alkaloids and they graze and consume lots of these stems and seed heads and these alkaloids, this results in symptoms of or of a syndrome that we call fescue toxicosis. And the calf that you can see on the right here is a classic example of a calf that would be afflicted with fescue toxicosis. So what we did was we investigated the herbicide Chaparral, which contains a chemical called metsulfuron. Um, Over 2 years at the Southwest Research Center in Mount Vernon, we took 16 paddocks of Kentucky 31 fescue that was 88% endophyte infected. The greater the endophyte infection level, the greater concentrations we're likely to see in ergot-like alkaloids in the fescue. And you know, for reference, 88% infected tall fescue would be considered hot fescue. Those 16 paddocks, we subjected them to one of four treatments: either no chaparral nor no nitrogen, so that would be our negative control, or we applied chaparral with either 0, 60, or 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre. The nitrogen was applied on March 11th, and the chaparral was applied on April 15th. Now, these steers were turned out 72 hours later, and they grazed for 57 days in 2019, 56 days in 2020. And it's important to note that one of the effects that we see with chaparral when we utilize it on pastures is we see a reduction in forage yield. The literature would suggest that yield reduction is around the neighborhood of 35%. We actually had to remove the Chap Zero steers, so the steers that were on pastures that were sprayed with chaparral but provided no nitrogen fertilizer. We removed those steers 17 days early in each of the 2 years because of a lack of forage. Okay, so the steers in 2019, we've got the steer performance on this slide here. So the green bar is the chaparral with no nitrogen, which you can see that we actually don't have weights on those steers for the second half of our trial because we removed them early due to a lack of forage. The gray bar is the chaparral with 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre. The red bar is chaparral with 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And the blue is the negative control. So no chaparral, no nitrogen. Now, across the y-axis, what we have is average daily gain per steer on a pounds per day basis. These steers were stocked at 1.5 steers per acre, so there were 6 steers on in each paddock, and the paddocks were 4.5 acres. The cattle gained exceptionally well during the first month of this trial. You can see our average daily gains ranged from 2.2 pounds per day in the negative control all the way up to 2.66 pounds per day in the SHAP 120. Now, in the second month of the trial, our gains were approximately 2/3 that of what they were in May. And overall, what it turns out to be is that the cattle gained, in the neighborhood of about 1.9 pounds per day over the course of the entire trial. In 2020, we saw excellent gains in the first month, and you'll notice that the chaparral treatments, the SHAP 60, the SHAP 120, well outgained the negative control. However, the inverse was true for the next month, such that overall we ended up with a range of average daily gains from 1.6 pounds to 1.86 pounds, with the SHAP 60 being the greatest and the negative control being the least. Okay, so what does this mean? We saw these results, part of our interpretation in these results is that what we saw was changes in forage distribution. I think an important um, forage yield distribution. An important note in this trial was that these cattle were continuously grazed on the same paddock the entire time. And also, we kept the same stocking rate across the 4 treatments, even though we expected that the nitrogen fertilizer was going to boost yield. What we were really interested in was the interaction of the nitrogen and the herbicide, the chaparral, because um, we know that the chaparral, reduces stems and seed heads, and in fact, it reduced across our 2 years of experiments, it reduced seed heads by 90% in the fields in May. However, what we weren't sure was how that might influence ergot alkaloids and how that might influence animal performance. And so you can tell here across the treatments that we had differences in forage yield at each month. And it appears that the nitrogen was effective at increasing forage yield relative to the negative controls. But it's also important to understand that we had cattle grazing on these pastures at each of these time points. And so, their demand for forage, their grazing might have influenced these results somewhat. Okay, and so the question becomes when you sit back and interpret this study, could we have increased the stocking rate in the chaparral plus nitrogen treatments? Could we have run 2 steers per acre? Could we have done greater? I would suggest that based on our forage yield, we could have, and it would have been interesting to see how that influenced animal performance. One thing that I point out about this study that I think is relevant as we talk about how we apply these results in the real world is that we had quite the forage base built up by the time we turned these cattle out in April. We could have turned these cattle out earlier, but the reason that we chose to wait till tax day to turn these cattle out was that we were waiting on the optimum timing of chaparral. And the later that you apply chaparral, and the closer to the boot stage, and when you get into the reproductive stage, when the plants develop the stems and seed heads, the more effective chaparral is. It's my opinion that we could have turned these cattle easily out a couple of weeks earlier than we did. And the final thing is that a managed grazing system would have increased forage utilization among these groups of cattle significantly. We, under a continuous grazing system, we typically would estimate that cattle will use, in the neighborhood of 30% of the forage that's actually grown. Under a managed grazing system, we could have increased that forage utilization, which would have allowed us to increase that stocking rate. But of course, it's unknown what that might have done to our animal performance, because gain per animal and gain per acre are sometimes work in conjunction under light stocking rates, where as we increase the gain per animal, we increase gain per acre. But under heavy stocking rates, we actually see gain per acre continue to increase, but gain per animal decrease. Now, why do I think that there's more to this story rather than just the chaparral? I set out to really, attempt at improving Missouri beef cattle production, knowing that, Missouri's a cow-calf state. And one of the big things we have with this cow-calf state in our forage base is that, we have more grass than we know what to do with in the spring, because tall fescue produces approximately half or 2/3 of its yield in the spring and a third in the fall. And that's described here on this graph that you can see. Now, when we keep the same number of animals on the farm 365 days a year, what happens is then we have times of the year where we have excess forage, we have more forage and we know what to do with. Now, our common management practice to date is to harvest that excess forage in the spring as hay and then feed it to our animals in times where we have deficiencies, such as the winter is the classic one we think about. But even now, those of y'all that might be in a drier part of the state, there's some folks that are starting to run out of forage and having to think about maybe feeding some hay in the next 30 days or so. I'm really interested in this stocker cattle concept, because I feel like what we could do is, rather than mechanically harvest that forage, we could use animals to graze that excess off. And not only that, we could graze that forage when its quality is high rather than um, waiting till summertime to get in the fields, to get in the pastures, cut hay, when we might get some impressive results in terms of tonnage, but have poor quality forage. There's a lot of folks that cut hay in June and July, and the quality is inadequate to support a non-lactating pregnant beef cow, much less a lactating beef cow who is near her peak nutrient requirements. I think being able to harvest that high quality feed early is an important concept in improving cattle production, forage management in this state. However, the difficult thing about making hay when we should, we typically will recommend that folks cut hay in May. However, when you cutting hay in May, the challenge with that is that May is the wettest month by precipitation, and so that makes it difficult for us to get in the field. And we often shoot for tonnage rather than thinking about quality. And so when we increase tonnage, we in hay harvest, that often comes at the expense of quality. Now, just so you all are aware, my background is I grew up in cow-calf operation in eastern New Mexico, but I did all of my graduate school training in Kansas. And one of the tenets of the Kansas, at least the eastern Kansas cattle production model, is stocker cattle systems in the Flint Hills. And these Flint Hill stocker cattle systems, they stretch from the Osage Hills in northeastern Oklahoma up through the eastern third of Kansas. And I pulled this quote out of an extension publication, which I provided the link to in the slide, that says, in tallgrass prairie, 2/3 of cattle gains occur by mid-July, and more than 2/3 of the forage is produced by that time. Intensive early stocking was designed to take advantage of high forage production and quality during the first half of the growing season while avoiding the late summer slump. Now, I want you all to stop and think about that for a second. To me, the authors of this publication could have been talking about tall fescue, because we run into the exact same situation that they did. Now, historically in Kansas, stocker cattle grazed for 180 days. They turned them out the 1st of May. They removed them sometime in October. And, years and years ago, they came up with the idea of running twice as many animals for half the amount of time. So rather than, a steer for every 4 acres for 180 days, they ran a steer on every 2 acres for 90 days. And what they saw was, nearly very similar animal performance in the two systems, but the gain per acre increased dramatically, and such that now the common production practice is to utilize this intensive early stocker cattle model for their grazing system. And so, as I kind of think about the project that we did, we unintentionally set up an intensive early stocker system. So we actually took these cattle in on the gain for somebody else. So somebody else owned the cattle and paid us to put weight on them. That influenced the way I designed that trial, because I didn't want to carry them through the summer slump, and I didn't want to run into a scenario where, we might see those cattle go backwards. And I know that a lot of folks, when you think about stocker cattle systems in the fescue belt, they think about, the summer slump. And, most people will talk about, well, we only get half a pound or 3/4 of a pound average daily gain in our stocker systems. But their stocker systems encompass both the high quality forage early on, but then the summer slump as well. And so I'm trying to promote or advocate, or at least consider, this intensive early stocker model. Now, it's interesting to think about that, because we are primarily a cow-calf state here in Missouri. But much like the statement from the Oklahoma Extension publication, we have more grass than we know what to do with in the spring. And currently, we spend a lot of time and money cutting hay to feed to our cows during times of forage shortage. And there's a lot of folks that'll say that that's an important component of forage management in Missouri. However, as a cow-calf operator myself, there's just not a lot of money in the commodity cow-calf production system where we raise commercial cattle, we sell them the calves at weaning at the sale barn. That is not a cash flowing business currently, and we have to ask questions about what can we do differently to improve the productivity of our lands. And so what I propose is a system where, perhaps I'm not advocating that we go away from cow-calf production in general, but if we, rather than stocking to our carrying capacity purely with beef cows, if we run a model where we have perhaps 66% cows, 33% stocker cattle, we have some flexible grazing units built into that. We can reduce hay feeding in the winter. We can generate some cash flow by taking cattle in on the gain, or we could also keep our fall-born calves and graze them for 60 days on some high-quality feed, knowing that we're going to get acceptable average daily gains without getting them fleshy before we market these cattle. So I think there's some real benefits to a system like this in our state. And so just to wrap it up, some final thoughts. While we're very early into this line of research, over the next few years, I plan to conduct several additional experiments as it pertains to stocker cattle systems in the fescue belt, and in particular focusing on Kentucky 31 fescue, because I believe that they're viable. Now, to be viable, you have to consider this intensive early stocking model, and we need to do a lot of work to define the intensive early stocking model in this state, because we know that we have high quality forage in April, May, and into early June. We need to harvest that, early at its peak quality. But what we don't know yet is when's the optimum time to turn cattle out, when's the optimum time to pull them off. A benefit of this system is that you let pastures rest during the summer slump, and you don't have to worry about cattle in during those months if you go to an all stocker system. The thing I would wrap up with and say that if you're listening to this and you have some experience with stocker cattle in Missouri, I'd love to hear your experiences with it, because I'm relatively new to this state, and I really like the idea. I think there's a lot of potential for us here, but I would love to hear from y'all if you have some experience doing this, and please call or email anytime. So once again, thank you all for your time. I really appreciate the opportunity to contribute to our Kaffner Ag Experiment Station virtual field days. Again, my name is Eric Bailey, and I'm the State Extension Beef Nutrition Specialist. My email and office phone number on the screen. Please call or email anytime. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you, and have a good afternoon.